Okay, so I'm giving a talk on how to brew beer, apparently for fun and profit. It's going to be a very... So it's going to be a very quick overview as to how one brews beer. It's going to skip a lot of the nuances of the steps and a lot of the details, and there's a lot of variations of what I'm describing. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of criticisms from people who know how to brew beer saying that that's not quite right, but shut up. And so yeah. So with brewing beer, there's about 4 steps that are much more detailed than I'm going to go over. The first step is making the wort, which is basically what is it's a sugary liquid that is then fermented into the beer itself. It's what the yeast eats and then creates alcohol, and it's what you boil to make the grains and hops and so forth, and that's what you end up fermenting. You then have a primary fermentation, which is where it actually eats the yeast, or the yeast eats the sugars and turns it into alcohol. And then optionally, depending on either recipe or your skill or otherwise what you're doing, there's a secondary fermentation, which is also known as conditioning. And then lastly, you have the bottling or the kegging, depending on what you're doing. So you need a bit of equipment to do it, and here's a brief list of basically what is minimally required. You need a large pot that's able to boil generally between, at an absolute minimum, 3 gallons, but preferably more, up to say about 5 gallons, depending on the size of the vat that you're making. You need a fermentation vessel, or vessels, depending on what you're doing. And you need an airlock, which basically allows, as the yeast eats the sugars, it will release CO2, and it needs to be able to let that CO2 out. So the airlock basically allows CO2 to escape without oxygen coming in, which could spoil the beer. The hydrometer is what's used to measure the density of the liquid, so that prior to fermentation, you're able to find out exactly how much the density of the alcohol, the density of the wort will tell you what it is before fermentation and afterwards, and you can use a mathematical calculation to find out the alcohol content of the beer thereafter. The thermometer is pretty obvious. There are some parts of the brewing process that need to be somewhat temperature dependent. The tubing is for transferring the wort and beer between different vessels. And the bottles and kegs should also be pretty obvious. And the cleaning supplies, because you're dealing with something that can easily spoil from bacteria, you need to make sure that you have everything very clean, more so than you would generally the average kitchen counter. So it's a very brief overview of making the wort. The shortcut process is that you go to a brewing store and you buy malt extract, which basically does most of it for you. Then, depending on the recipe you're using, you then add hops and other things, depending on the recipe, into the wort, which you boil in water, generally between 2 and 3 gallons, and you add extra water on top of that. And then the other method, which is considered truer or more advanced, is the all-grain method, where you basically, instead of buying the wort extract, the malt extract, you basically make it yourself by getting the grains, which is a very involved process of soaking at the right temperature for the right amount of time, depending on what you're doing, using the right grains. And you can see that with the shortcut process that I have listed here. The primary fermentation consists of you putting it into a primary fermentation vessel, which is something like a 5-gallon or 6-gallon plastic bucket that's sealed, and you add the yeast to it. And depending on what you're doing, you generally use either a dry yeast that you just sprinkle on top of it, or you may need to use a pre-started thing. Where you basically you add the yeast to a sugary solution so that it starts to eat the sugars before you add it to the wort itself, which allows it to more quickly start the process of fermenting the beer, which can both make it faster to ferment the alcohol itself, and it can also make a healthier fermentation so that you get a better beer in the end. However, the variations of this are pretty vast, so it really depends on what you're doing for the specific recipe and the skill level that you're looking for. The secondary fermentation is also called conditioning beer because not much fermentation actually takes place. It involves you taking out everything you can from the primary fermentation vessel and putting it into a second vessel. It's also airtight and has an airlock as well. But for the most part, you leave the yeast behind. And you end up, depending on what you're doing, especially for liking the beer, this will be elaborate. It ends up, it can affect the taste of the beer drastically. And it depends on what you're doing as to whether or not you do a secondary fermentation. And then last, there's just the bottling and kegging, or kegging rather. If you're bottling it, you basically just add it to the bottles, disturbing it as little as possible, or to the keg as little as possible. And with the bottles, it takes approximately 3 weeks thereon in order to carbonate the bottles, or about a week if you force carbonate in a keg with CO2. And as a quick plug here, I'm going to be doing a workshop at Noisebridge, which I will be posting to the mailing list and announcing at meetings in the near future. So if somebody's interested in brewing beer, we're going to be brewing beer here, and you're welcome to participate as much as you want or don't want. And we'll have some beer, and within a month, I imagine, that people will then be able to taste. Okay?